welcome all of you here today to our conference, Defend Public Education Now. And this effort that we've been engaged in to defend public education is not just a statewide effort, but national and international. Public education is a critical aspect of our society, the right to a public education and the right to a great public education. And in California, in San Francisco, we have more billionaires than any place else in the world, apparently. Yet, schools are being cut, school funds are being cut, and also, we'll talk about it, there's an effort to destroy a mural, to spend $600,000 destroying a mural in San Francisco at George Washington High, then putting that into more teachers and education programs on the issue of the history of the United States, the history of Native Americans. So we see the priorities as a problem, but what we want to talk about this morning is the attack, the organized political ideological attack on public education, because we cannot understand what is happening with the crisis in public education without really looking at the economic interests that benefiting by privatization, but also looking at the ideological driven agenda of the billionaires in the United States who want to destroy public education. Betsy DeVos is only an expression, open expression, of the people who are really running the education system nationally. Their idea of education is for profit. It's a market-driven ideology. And in fact, when charters were being pushed, they had films saying that you had to win a lottery to get a good public education. People remember that? I mean, the whole idea that you have to be in a lottery to get a good public education is a capitalist idea. It's a capitalist ideology. So what we're talking about is a political agenda, an economic agenda, and also an agenda that's been supported by both Democrats and Republicans. The Obama administration, Arne Duncan, helped push charters and spent our tax dollars to award money for charters throughout the United States. This is still happening. There are tax deductions for the charterizers, the privateers, and I think some of you we first met around Ron Beller, the billionaire who wanted to do good in Richmond. He wanted to help out, and it turns out he had other things in mind than helping out. It's a land grab and also the public money for his public schools. So our first speaker is Carlos Taboada, and Carlos is a longtime educator, not just in this country, but in Mexico. And he has been involved in the struggle in the West Contra Costa School District to defend public education. He's run for the board a number of times and is very familiar about the history of public education and the attacks that public education has faced. So welcome, Carlos Taboada.
Before we start, I think that we should have a clear idea of what we're talking about, what are charter schools. So we'll have two, I'll give you two definitions. One given to us by Diane Ravitch in her latest book. I forgot the hoax of something. He says that very clearly charter schools are publicly financed but privately managed schools. Publicly financed by but privately managed schools. In Spanish, a couple years ago at some conference we had, the translation they gave for charter schools was autonomous, escuelas autónomas subvencionadas, autonomous subsidized schools. That's a very, very clear descriptive definition of charter schools that tells us a great deal of what they are. Okay? They are autonomous. It is as if we had an autonomous, a separate, an alternative school district as part of the regularly democratically controlled school district. We have one anti-democratically run or contra-democratically run because it is a corporate education project. And I think that we should, I would like to start also by putting the charter movement in its in its proper context, just in the recent history, who started charter schools and why and what happened. And the charter school movement was launched by two educators with impeccable liberal credentials, and that is where the flaw lies, impeccable liberal credentials, Albert Schagner and Ray Bood. Schagner was president of the United Federation of Teachers from 64 to 85, and president of the American Federation of Teachers from 1975 to 1997. Bood was a teacher, a junior high principal, and a teacher of educational administration at the University of Massachusetts. In his call was made in 1974, that year, the idea of an autonomous, and here we need to understand that charter schools begin as the neoliberal response to a deeply felt need for teachers, a radical movement, a teachers unspoken, really not fully articulated, but a teacher idea of having teacher-run schools, okay? Schools where the tools of our trade, lesson plans, the content of curriculum are designed by teachers to meet the needs of the students in front of them. So that was the idea. Schagner was inspired, and he says so. I don't have the exact, I wrote it in a card, but he was inspired by the latest management techniques in the automobile industry. What I forgot is the exact name of the corporation, but the idea is this. You have a huge corporation, maybe General Motors, and General Motors makes all kinds of cars, but they want to break into new markets. They want a new product. Their sales are kind of stagnant. They need a shot in the arm. So they commission, a fraction, a department of this huge mega corporation breaks away, so to speak, and designs, free from the bureaucracy, free from the chains of command, from the top down, the board of directors down to the plant level, and designs a new automobile, a new model to be launched in the market. Our friend Schagner said, hey, why don't we do that in education? And that was the idea. That's how his brainchild of a charter school was born. At the beginning, charter schools, there was some response from small anarchist, free-thinking teachers. And they formed what the idea was supposed to be: teacher-run schools, closely linked to the community, with active parent participation. Well, the experiment did not last long. Despite a propitious start, the Schagner liberal utopian dream of teacher-run, community-based charter schools did not last long. Only 6 years after Schagner's call for school reform, he was among the first to denounce the takeover of the movement by academic bureaucrats and corporate and philanthropic entrepreneurs. In his column, he used to publish a column on the New York Times called Where We Stand. His column of July 3rd, 1994, his weekly column, he denounced the Detroit school system for, quote, giving $4 million for starters to a group of people who are eager for public funds but could care less about public education. He argued that charters should not operate totally unconnected to the school district that sponsors them. He denounced corporate educators, saying, but there are other supporters of charter schools whose real aim is to smash the public school. Unless charter school legislation is carefully crafted, charter schools will not lead to improved public education. Instead, we will see money used to pay for educating kids whose parents are already looking after their education at home, or to finance what are really private schools. And all this will take place without any public debate and totally out of the public eye. The other started of the charter schools, Ray Bood, continued to champion the idea of charter schools, and like Al Schagner, upheld the notion that charter schools should operate well within the public school system and should never be thought of as alternative to public education. Well, obviously, that's what they have become. Okay? They have become an alternative district. Charter school advocates' key argument is that charter schools are public schools, and as such, they are tuition-free, funded according to enrollment levels, and receive public funds on a per-pupil basis. In California, additional funds or loans are made available to them. In most states, charters, however, do not receive capital funds to support facility expenses. Charter schools are entitled to federal categorical funds for which their students are eligible, such as Title I and special education monies. Federal legislation provides grants to help charters to manage startup costs. The public, in quotations, the public character of charter schools is based solely on the fact that they receive public funds. But receiving public monies, as it has been observed, does not make a business a public one. If that were the case, the pharmaceutical industry and many others who benefit from tax-generated revenues will be public enterprises as well. In a recent radio interview, that rabbit said, "Just try suing a charter school. Their lawyers will immediately state that they are not public schools." Behind the legal fiction that charters are public lies a conception of the public sphere centered on market relations. And that, I believe, is one of the important ideological twists that we see with this charter school movement, this corporate reform movement, and that is to present us with what has been called by other writers capitalist realism. Okay? Capitalist realism is, as I stated earlier, the conception of the public sphere centered on market economic relations. Mark Fisher has argued that capitalist realism has propagated a business ontology, that's his expression, a business ontology, which concludes that everything should be run as a business, including education and healthcare. So that, and I started out, I'll end this shortly, started out saying that charters, the translation, the Spanish translation of charter schools was autonomous subsidized schools. And I just like to point out the amount of the subsidies and how is this subsidy or this financial impact calculated. Very simple. 6,000 students, for instance, in our school district, 6,000 students mean approximately $60 million less that the district receives in funds from average daily attendance. So we lose money by having 6,000 students in a charter school, but we also save some money by not having to educate those 6,000 students. And if we subtract the money that we saved from the money that we lost, we obtain the net financial impact for our district. And I have to say that independently, Defend Public Education now, we came out with a figure of $30 million just by eyeballing similar studies. And lo and behold, it's turned out that we were correct within by 2/10 because a recent study, I won't pull it out, but a recent study by the Oakland group called In the Public Interest determined that indeed West Contra Costa Unified School District finances or suffers a net financial impact of $27 or $28.9 million per year. That's round figures, $30 million that we don't have, okay? Because notice that if we lose 6,000 students to the charter schools, that doesn't mean that we're gonna close schools, because all 6,000 students did not come from one group of schools, they came from different schools. So the school district is still stuck with all the fixed expenses of running a school, but now we have $30 million less and 6,000 students less. Just to finish up, just to inform you, the subsidy calculated in the way that I described for Our neighbor district, Oakland, is $57 million. For Los Angeles is $500 million, and so it goes.
One of the problems in public education is that this attack, this political and ideological attack, so one of the problems is the lack of education about what charters. And in 2016, I and other advocates of public education put together an initiative with the support of Kathleen Carroll, who's an education lawyer and whistleblower who worked for the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, for the repeal of the California Charter School Law in 1992. And we got support from teachers from throughout the state, but there were two things that happened. One is that the teachers union in Los Angeles, UTLA, said that they couldn't support this initiative. One of their members had said that they would support it and then pulled back, and she argued that we can't support this initiative because we're trying to organize the charter schools. That's what she said. So this idea that we can't stop public money going to privately run charter schools because we're not going to be able to organize charter schools is an acceptance of a two-tier system in public education. And also a complete failure on the part of the teachers' unions, both the CTA and the CFT, California Federation of Teachers, and the NEA and AFT to clarify what charter schools are. Because a major propaganda of this charter schools is that they're public schools. That's what they put out, that they're public schools. In reality, they are not public schools, and that's what the state of Washington ruled, Supreme Court, the court, saying that charter schools are not common schools because they're privately run. So in both instances, the question of education is critical. What are charter schools? And why have the unions failed to do the necessary education, even among their own members, to explain what charter schools are, how they're growing, and what role they play in every district in California. And our next speaker, Professor George Wright, taught at Chico State College for many, many years, and then also moved to the Bay Area and began teaching at Skyline College. And he began to write about corporatization of public education and how that was taking place and what that meant for public education. And for that, he was ignored by the union, the CFT, and like, we don't want to talk about what's happening to public education. This is a serious question. If our unions refuse to educate people about what charters are and what they're doing, we have a serious, basic, fundamental problem. So without further ado, welcome George Wright.
I'm going to follow up on what Steve talked about related to my experiences at Skyline College. Just a quick background. I consider myself a child of the California Master Plan for Higher Education because I started going to college, in junior college in 1962, and LA Harbor JC down in Los Angeles. And then I went to Cal State Chico and eventually taught there for 34 years, and then taught at Skyline. So and also I went to public high school as well. And so I've been able to not only watch the development of privatization and corporatization of education, but I've been involved directly in battles to try to slow it down or prevent it. And thirdly, I've also been a victim of corporatization and privatization in some ways. The specific story is I retired, when I started teaching at Chico State back in 1969-70, the state colleges were still expanding dramatically because of the baby boom generation coming into college. And there were also political battles on campuses that spilled out into the streets, or vice versa. They spilled from the streets onto the campus. And I think many of you here remember the great battles for black studies back in the late 1960s. And even though San Francisco State takes great pride in its fight to develop the ethnic studies program, these kinds of things were happening on campuses all over the country, and they certainly were happening at Chico State as well. And I was hired there to teach in Black Studies, and then I was incorporated into the political science department. And at that time, because of the great expansion, give you an example, in 1964, I think Chico had about 4,500 students. By 1970, the student population was about 15,000. So we have about a 10,000 student increase in 5 or 6 years. And I think this happened throughout the system in California. And what I remember is how much fun teaching was in the late 60s, early 70s, up until about 1977, 78, when we were a state college and we were told our mission was simply teaching, and unlike the university campus. But starting about 1970, and there was an enormous amount of camaraderie and collaboration among various faculty and departments. Regularly, people from psychology, Bill Rector, would ask me to come in and talk about personal experiences related to living in Los Angeles and Watts, et cetera, et cetera. Sociology teachers, philosophy teachers. But by the late 70s, things began to be more institutionalized and more structured and more and the trajectory of privatization was on the way. For example, one of the first issues that I recall in the late 70s being discussed was the ratio of full-time faculty versus part-time faculty, okay? And I remember a formula was determined by our department, which then had to go, that was poli-sci, which then had to go up to the dean and then to the vice president, and decisions were made elsewhere. But the ratio, I think, was about 60 full and 40 part-time. So that was one of the beginnings of what I saw in this process. To make a long story short, I retired from Chico back around 2003, 2004, and luckily fell into a full-time job at Skyline and a community college. And one of my thoughts at that time was, man, how lucky am I to fall into a full-time job with a pension already at stake. But teaching at Skyline felt like it was like Chico in the early 70s. I mean, teaching was the priority. But gradually each year, I began to feel this encroachment of corporatization and privatization as well. And I think everybody in the room is knowledgeable about what was going on at San Francisco City College during this period. But one day I just said to myself, George, you've been in the classroom for 44, 45 years, and you have to draw a line somewhere. And the line was student learning outcomes, as you guys probably are aware of. And I knew categorically what student learning outcomes was about. It was basically standardization of curriculum, which undermined the creativeness and artistic nature of what teaching is about, the spontaneous, improvised, creative work that teachers try to do in the classroom. And also I knew that related to me being at least a revisionist historian, if not a Marxist theoretical scholar, was going to be marginalized and put out and forced out the door at some point. And critical thinking was going to be undermined as well. And so one day I just said, this is in 2013, one day I just said to myself, George, you've been fighting this struggle for 40-some years, and you're going to retire soon, and your legacy, when you're lying in bed and you're 85 years old and you reflect on your teaching, there's no way I wanted to say to myself, well, the last couple of years I sold out to my pedagogic principles, my political principles, and also the moral principles I felt about the classroom. And so I didn't make a date as to when I was going to bail out at that point, but a situation happened in March of 2013 that made the decision rather easy. We had a division meeting. This was social science at Skyline, and I'm not going to mention any particular names here, but it was a good group of people over the 8 years I was there, and we could shout out certain slogans and things, and everybody would kind of giggle and laugh and contribute to the discussion. Well, the discussion that particular day was about the school preparing for the accreditation process that was going to be put in place the year before, with the specter of what had been going on at City College over the previous 2 or 3, 4 years. And so there was a lot of concern and tension. And somehow the discussion centered around SLOs. In fact, a member of the executive board of the local union was giving a presentation about SLOs and changes in the curriculum, et cetera. And someone who I admired in the audience kind of asked a question, and she asked this person, what were SLOs all about? And the person from the union said, I don't know. And I just blurted out, it's about standardization of public education. And at that moment, the dean, who had hired me, and I thought we had a decent relationship, came and ran right into my face, literally inches away, and said, will you come with me? Will you come with me? And I was, 68 years old at the time. And there was absolutely, she was treating me like I was a first grader, that just peed in my pants or something, And I said, no, I'm not going to come. And she repeated this 3 or 4 times, and then finally gave up and went back to the front of the classroom. And I sat there and I said, I think this is the moment. This is the moment. And so I said, I don't belong here. I said to myself, and I got up and walked out and went over to San Francisco State and worked out over on the track, and was happy that I did what I did. And about 3 weeks later, by the way, a lot of tension, people would walk up to me and said, you spoiled the meeting and all this kind of stuff. And then some faculty rallied around me, but they were afraid to do anything because I was, 68, I was prepared. Financially, I could retire, but people 51 or 52 or 47 or 58, they were stuck, and they couldn't take any risks. So people talked to me positively, but I knew that I wasn't going to get any solidarity. The union wasn't going to back me up on this. And so, again, about 3 weeks later, I got an email from the dean. And I thought, wow, the dean was going to say in the email, George, I'm really sorry that I jammed you the way I did. I was under a lot of stress. She had been involved in preparing the document for the accreditation the next year and all this kind of stuff. And she had some personal issues that she was dealing with. So I just naively assumed that this email is going to say, I apologize, and you're a great faculty member and all this kind of stuff. And instead, the email read, in a very officious way, would you make an appointment to come by my office, and you can bring a union representative with you, because I'm very concerned about your behavior, quote unquote, in that division meeting. Now, to be very candid with you, I'm very sensitive to the word behavior, okay? I don't even like to say little children have poor behavior. And part of why I'm sensitive to it, because my main study and research area is U.S. foreign policy and international politics, and the United States has, whenever it targets some government for destabilization and rollback, they always say that Soviet behavior, Putin's behavior, et cetera, which to me implies that the U.S. is the master and the other country is not. And when you apply it to an old black guy, my behavior, what are you talking about? And so when I got that email, I said to myself, this is the moment I'm going to retire. And so, because I can't accept this anymore related to my legacy, which I could fill in if anybody ever was concerned about that or curious. And the irony is I went online to find how do you write a letter of retirement. And I found this document, but it said I had to send it to the dean to start the process, which I did. But anyway, that's a little story. I hope it has some relevance to what we're talking about here. What I'd like to do, if I have 10 more minutes, hopefully, to kind of give some kind of context to what the topic is about and what Carlos was talking about related to why we are where we're at, related to this trajectory of privatization and corporatization of public education with the manifestation of the charter schools, et cetera. I'm going to try to make about 5 points, and rather than reading from my document, I'm going to try to do this extemporaneously. First point I want to make is that the modern public school system was shaped basically in the late 19th century. And we see, obviously, elementary and secondary schools set up. And we see also teacher training schools, or so-called normal schools, and also ag research schools, like the old A and M schools on levels of higher education. The basic function of, let's just focus on secondary education at this point, the basic function of education from the outset was to do two things. One was to socialize students in a covert and overt curriculum. One was to teach young people Americanism/patriotism, to teach English to the recent immigrants to the United States, and to train people into and also to propagate an image or a narrative about what America was all about. The second level was a channeling process, and that is to channel people into particular sectors of the economy. This was based on on class. This was based on race, and it was also based on gender as well. And I think all of us in the room have some idea about that. To leap forward in the post-World War II period related to elementary, secondary, and higher education, I think those functions continued. But a second function, I think, was added to the higher education, and that was to house a reserve labor pool, okay, with the advent of the enormous baby boom explosion of the late 50s, early 60s, et cetera. What we also see is in the channeling process, in the socialization and the channeling process, we see an additional contributions. One related to socialization was to add, what was added was the commitment to the U.S.'s Cold War anti-Soviet project, which I would say continues to this day in the form of anti-Russia and anti-Putin, which I think is the same project with just different labels, perhaps. And also we see the more of a commitment to the sciences, engineering, mathematics, et cetera, particularly in the aftermath of the Sputnik phenomena in 1957. Now, starting in the 1970s, what we see is corporate interests, corporations, Wall Street, foundations, think tanks, policy planning organizations, the media, et cetera, including right-wing forces, particularly so-called Sunbelt wealth, forming parallel and integral foundations, policy planning organizations, the churches, et cetera, and the political establishment, both the Republicans and the Democrats, began a systematic political assault on what we knew as what we understood to be public education. And this is at all levels. Now, I think everybody in the room understands many of those characteristics. One of them is charter schools. What we can see, state and local budget cuts resulting in teacher and staff layoffs, increased teacher-student ratios, the reduction of class offerings, particularly in the humanities, social sciences, the arts, and physical education, restructuring curriculum to rein in the humanities and the social sciences while emphasizing basic skills, standardized testing, assessments, career training, et cetera, increasing the cost of education by raising student tuition, therefore forcing students to pay an ever-larging share of the cost of public education, and much of those increases were channeled into paying graduate school research for profit, and the money's used for salaries and infrastructure to pursue that route. And also the banks play a role in this, being forced to borrow huge sums of money from commercial banks to pay for their education, which is part of the privatization process. We could go on and on and on this list. Now, the next point is, why was this assault on public education? Why did it take place? I think this is the big picture here. One is that in the late 60s and into the 70s, what we see is a structural crisis of capitalism, of global capitalism. And during the 70s, what we see is the beginnings of a restructuring of capitalism, not only domestically, but globally. And I'm not going to talk about where it was. We can talk about if there are any Q&As. But what took place was two developments. One is the development of a new accumulation model, or a new capital accumulation model. Prior to the 70s, the core element of the capitalist accumulation model was the automobile industrial complex, and also military spending. And all of what that implied: glass, concrete, construction, malls, highways, the spinoffs were enormous. And with the new accumulation model, what you see is, one, a deindustrialization of the U.S. political economy and putting and outsourcing production to the third world where labor costs were cheaper. And the restructured accumulation model was to earn off of the outsourcing, make profit from the outsourcing, but also what we have is deregulation, cutting taxes for the wealthy, more increased subsidization by the government for corporations, the privatization of the public sector, more military spending, et cetera, et cetera. So at the core of what I'm trying to say is that privatization began to be a central part of the capital accumulation model that was developed in the 1970s. And this was to privatize everything. I remember personally in 1975, up until this particular day, when I paid my local property taxes, that money went to the city, and the city paid workers to pick up my garbage. But then there was a given day when I saw a truck come by to pick up my garbage cans, and it was a private company. And I received a bill at the end of the month for picking up my garbage. Do you guys see what I'm trying to say here? And so all of a sudden, we now see this privatization take place, and it was visible right in front of our eyes. and it's obviously accelerated to where it dominates much of our political economy. Specifically related, and the second development, the first was a capital accumulation model. The second element was a new hegemonic ideology from, let's say, 1900 to about 1980. The hegemonic ideology was corporate liberalism. Perhaps we understand that better as New Deal liberalism. And at the core of that, if there are transgressions or crises of capitalism, people protested, and the government responded by addressing those crises or problems within the framework of capitalism. The civil rights movement would be a classic example of the role of government in that process. The new ideology was something called neoliberalism, which Carlos refers to. And this ideology became two things. One, a worldview, and as Carlos mentioned, people have been literally propagandized, if not brainwashed, by our media and the rhetoric of our society to look at the world differently. Part of the mantra that was hammered starting in the 70s was government is bad, government is inefficient, the market is good. It's repeated over and over again. Education is about choice. It's not about self-actualization, okay, and preparing people to be good citizens. You go to college now to get a good job, not to become a well-rounded person, et cetera, et cetera. So you begin to look at things entirely differently. Neoliberalism is also a guideline for public policy. Cut taxes, deregulate, privatize, break unions, et cetera, et cetera. So when I look at the privatization of public education, I believe it's one part of the new capital accumulation model, and it is also a part of public policy. And it's more specifically related to education is that more than $1 trillion a year is spent on public education, and this privatized education industrial complex, if you want to call it, sees all of this money, and they want to suck it into their portfolios. So the privatization is driven by the fact that the private sector, aided by the federal government and state and local governments and the union bureaucrats and the administrators as well, including the current superintendent in San Francisco, support this. Now let me finish up by saying what must be done to confront this. There are a couple points I want to make that I think are very important. One is to recognize that the assault on public education specifically and the public sector in general is not simply a bipartisan Republican Democratic political policy, but is dictated by the imperative of capital to maximize profit. Moreover, the assault on the public sector is not simply a national project, but is occurring throughout the interstate world capitalist system. The common label for this project is austerity. Secondly, recognize that the Democratic Party and the trade union bureaucracy are agents of the neoliberal profit accumulation model and therefore cannot be considered vehicles or agents or allies for progressive and radical change, or for that matter, even preserving what we have as the status quo. Three, what must be done is formulate a counter-hegemonic political agenda that provides a clear and comprehensive alternative to neoliberal capitalism. A new agenda consists of public ownership of the banks, redistribution of wealth and income, slashing the military budget, commitment to mass transit cooperatives, free education, and health care, investment in alternative energy, et cetera, and you can add whatever you want to add to the list. Fourth, form a massive, broad-based, unified anti-capitalist coalition willing to confront and withstand the repressive and manipulative power of the United States power structure while carrying out the counter-hegemonic agenda. And finally, I want to add, I remember about 10 years ago, students at Berkeley were demanding a refunding of public education based on cuts that had been taking place. And the term refund was, I think, the banner of much of those protests. And I began thinking about, and I came to the following: one must recognize that it is not simply enough to refund public education and the public sector to effect progressive and radical political change. Refunding education will not alter the corporatization and privatization of public education. Refunding public education will also not alter the neoliberal profit accumulation model. Public education must be redefined to serve society within the context of a complex transformation of the society. That redefinition should include blah, blah, blah. You guys all know what it should include. So anyway, those are my comments. Thank you. Well, I agree. And to add to that, getting a college education does not lead to social justice. It leads to being channeled into two things, at least, being channeled into particular niches within the economy, and secondly, increase, massive debt, which benefits the banks, et cetera. So that's why I say that education has to be redefined completely.
We know from the surveys that we've done that our students in West Contra Costa want auto shop, they want sex education, they want personal finance, they even want full day, whatever the correct term is.
For boys,
Yeah.
For boys as well.
It's,
And
no.
yet these courses are no longer offered.
As Steve mentioned when he introduced me, I have run twice for a position on the school board, and one of the programs, one of the points that I emphasized was that we should break away from this schizoid conception of education and human development, that either you want a liberal arts education or you want something else, just science education. And I propose a different model, to join, to vinculate both of them. You don't need to prepare some people for, technical education, other people for, higher studies. That the two of them should be combined. I mean, there is, we are at that point in our history that we can, take up a 21st century version of the Renaissance man. That didn't split his knowledge into two competing spheres. Yeah.
One of the things that is that capitalism right now and technology, here we are in San Francisco, the development of artificial intelligence, the development of robotic cars that are going to put, and trucks that are going to put millions of people out of work, change the whole dynamic of the situation. In other words, the development of these technologies now mean that millions and millions of workers are no longer needed within the capitalist framework. That's why some billionaires are saying, well, like this guy Yang who's running for president, I think, we should give $1,000 a person. We should do something to help out people who are going to be displaced. So what does that mean as far as education? They don't need all these educated people. I mean, even educated people in radiology, engineers are going to be displaced as a result of automation and technology. This is a crisis for our whole system, not here, but worldwide, not only here, but worldwide. And it's a social crisis. And it's not being addressed by our unions. It's not being addressed, well, some billionaires are saying we have to do something about it because they're worried about the social explosion. In community colleges now, they're being destroyed and turned into private operations because they say we no longer need it. If you want an education or a trade, go to a private school. That's what they're doing. So they're closing down here in San Francisco whole departments. I mean, nursing department is being closed. Television production are being closed. I mean, so what they're saying is we don't need you anymore. And this is being was pushed by Governor Brown, who spent $150 million of our money for online education. And the SEIU, which is supporting this, SEIU statewide leadership, will say we have to train our members in engineering and coding. So we'll go to these online classes. So we'll be helpful to the healthcare industry. Well, since when should we destroy public education, get rid of teachers, and go online? Who does that benefit? What education process does that benefit? So we're talking about a basic structural crisis that has to be confronted, and it's not. And as George pointed out in Los Angeles, there's a great book by Gilmore called Golden Gulag, which talks about the deindustrialization of Los Angeles. They destroyed all the industry, and instead they put the young people there, African American, Latino, in prisons.
Yeah,
They pumped into drugs. They pumped into drugs and put them in prison. So you have a social crisis. I mean, when kids are homeless, and you have like 3 families living together to survive, what kind of education process are we going to have in the schools? That's the question. Morris, you had a question? Yeah.
I want to know if Carlos and George are going to put their presentations online somewhere.
Yes, it's all going to be online.
So they're printed, they're remarks, okay.
Yeah.
So we can see public schools, and it's a reflection of that new deal to deal with transformation, right? The same way. What I'm concerned about is that as a teacher.
I have a suggestion. We're going to have another panel which you can join. Okay, you're going to ask a question? Okay, go.
No, I was saying, what's our suggestion for reaching the new teacher who all they know, especially in Los Angeles, is work at part charter school? There are no public school jobs on EdJoin.
That's right.
All charter school jobs. And I would pay my $1,000 to find in the last 5 years 100 charter public school jobs. They're not even there.
Yeah.
I would insist that teachers, that we should look at ourselves as what we are, intellectual workers, and that we should demand complete and absolute control over the tools of our trade, see? And educational objectives, content of curriculum, choice of textbooks, those should be the prime decisions that teachers every year should be asked to make. It is our trade, it is our profession, and those are the tools of our trade, and they've been taken away from us. They want us to build a sculpture, and they give us a ton of marble, but they give us wooden tools. We can't work that way. We should be, in other words, we should be running our schools, not school bureaucrats, or not blindly taking directions from Washington or wherever.
The commodification of education is what we're talking about. I mean, imagine giving kindergarten kids tests. What's the purpose of that? For kindergarten kids getting tests? Well, there is a purpose for it. For Pearson and Company, they make money selling tests. The more tests, the more money. And that's the case with teachers. But the Common Core, again, was supported by the teachers' unions. In fact, they took hundreds of millions of dollars from the Gates Foundation and other foundations to make Common Core work. I mean, I was at a convention of the California Federation of Teachers, and they had a panel at the convention on making Common Core work. So if your unions are actually saying that we need to make Common Core work, they bought into the idea of commodification, taking the power out of the hands of teachers to make the determination of what books should be taught and classes. And the other thing is that since when do you have to have a private company have education tests for your classes. Teachers are quite capable of providing tests. They're aware of what's going on. They're the best, but it's, again, commodification, making money out of public education. That's what this is all driven by. And that whole ideology has to be something that our unions challenge. The union has to challenge the capitalist ideology that has been propagated in our school system. And as far as the charter school teachers, what is happening is they're telling people, if you want a job, you're not going to get in a public school, you're going to get in a charter school. And also they're saying, if you want your children to be educated by African-American teachers, you have to go to a charter school. That's what they did in San Francisco. They're getting rid of the African-American teachers in this PAR program, which we'll be talking about later. And then they tell the parents then, if you want African-American teachers for your kids, you have to go to a charter school. This is a way of pushing the population, African-American population, into charter schools. It's really despicable and criminal how they're manipulating the education system with their agenda, corporate agenda.